Ian Sachs back here, joined by Daly Dose of Hoops founder Jaden Daly. One day after Iona makes a splash announcement hiring Rick Pitino as its next head coach. Jaden, tell me your initial reaction.
You hit the nail on the head calling it a splashy, and I think it's probably the biggest splash any New York program has made in the last maybe 10 years. I think bigger even than St. John's hiring Steve Lavin to replace Norm Roberts. What this does for Iona is it upholds the standards and the commitment to excellence that Tim Cluess established and cultivated over the last decade. You bring in a Hall of Fame coach, and really you could have gone either way between Rick Pitino and Jared Grasso, debating who would be the better fit for this program. Each had their own impressive credentials, but when you have somebody like Rick Pitino who wanders into your midst, even with all the NCAA badges that I'm sure he's going to bring with him and will be questioned, and rightfully so, if you're Iona, you can't be blamed, and you can't fault yourselves for taking a chance on him. And that's exactly how I believe Matt Glavasky, the AD, and Seamus Carey, the president, felt when they went through this process.
Jaden, you mentioned it, probably coming down to Pitino and former Iona associate head coach Jared Grasso, now the head man at Bryant University. What do you think was the difference that made Pitino the guy for Glavasky and Carey?
His desperation, as crazy as it may sound, when you're away from the college game and it's essentially all you know, aside from his 2 stints in the NBA, and you're talking about somebody who was coaching in another country and having to deal with that and the uncertainty with the Greek season now in light of the coronavirus outbreak that canceled all of our seasons here as well, and not only basketball, but just also for spring sports as well. Baseball, across track and field, they're not having any seasons either. When you're somebody like Rick Pitino who knows he still has one last shot in him to have one more moment in the sun, so to speak, you'll take anything that comes their way, and I think that's what led him to get this job at Iona, with Tim Cluess stepping down Friday and then 27 hours later an announcement being made on his successor. His desperation, coupled with Iona not wanting to let this situation linger given what was out there and possibly let something slip away regardless of who the candidate and the choice may have ended up being, I think that combined to expedite this decision a little faster.
So what's next for Pitino on the sideline with the Gaels?
Well, let's see what kind of players he brings in and what kind of players he retains. Right now, Isaiah Washington and Isaiah Ross are both supposed to come back for one more year. They'll be seniors next season. There's still a little bit of a core behind them as well, but this is going to be another roster overhauling, and we've seen it over time with Iona, with Tim Cluess bringing in guys over the summer. The roster now is not going to be the same as it'll look in October and November. I do think that this team will probably be a middle-of-the-road MAC team next year, just based on what's coming back right now. If I had to do an early preseason poll, I'd probably have him 5th to 6th, and that's being generous just based on everything else. I do think there's a consensus top 2 in the MAC next year, and that's Siena and Monmouth, assuming that everybody stays there. Quinnipiac Actor's going to be formidable. St. Peter's will probably be picked toward the top 5. Manhattan brings everybody except Tyler Reynolds back. So Rick's got his work cut out for him, but if he's as desperate as he has portrayed himself to be, he won't waste any time trying to rebuild this program and get it back to where it's been.
You touched a lot on his filling out the roster. Where do you see he might go for filling out his staff and assistant coach picks?
Well, it's a little early to speculate, but I've heard a few names already. I've heard David Padgett, who replaced him as the interim coach at Louisville after he was let go in the wake of the Brian Bowen scandal. He's been out of a job for the last year or two. He would make a perfect, associate head coach, so to speak. Another name that I think should be one to watch is Casey Stanley, and he's familiar to Iona fans. His father, Gary, was the longtime play-by-play voice of the Gaels for decades, and he was also on staff with Kevin Willard as well before going to Minnesota and UNC Wilmington. Now he's at Arkansas State. I could see Rick Pitino possibly bringing him home. Maybe one of his other players, I don't know. We'll see what happens. There's also the possibility that he might try to take one of Steve Masiello's assistants from Manhattan. Who knows? There's still a lot of conjecture, and rightfully so. We don't know exactly who he's going to look for. There's also a chance that I think Ralph Willard might come on as somewhat of a special assistant to the head coach type deal, like we've seen with St. John's when Steve Lavin brought Gene Cady on board. Maybe somebody with his expertise can help shepherd a young team. We'll see where it goes.
For sure. It's still plenty of time before we tip off the 2020-2021 season. And Jaden, you mentioned Masiello there. He played with Pitino, or he played for Pitino at Kentucky. I'm sure that's one of the matchups you have circled on your calendar. What other matchup are you most excited for seeing Pitino in the MAC next year?
I'd like to see him take on Siena. Carmen Massarello, after Pitino got the job, came out and said he wants to compete against the best. It'll make him and his program better. I do want to see what Pitino tries to do to Jalen Pickett, to Manny Camper, to Don Carey. It's a team that won 20 games this past season, won 10 in a row to end the year. A group that I think should be and probably will be the prohibitive favorites in the MAC next season. That's going to be a fun battle at Hines and at times Union. Manhattan, obviously, with the subplots between Pitino and Masiello, was this ball boy with the Knicks, played for him, coached under him, coached against him, and almost beat him in the NCAA Tournament 6 years ago.
Right.
You have your rivalries, Ian. You have your juicy matchups. I think Manhattan and Siena are probably the top two. And there's also the intrigue of what he's going to do against a team like St. Peter's, which is going to be just as deep and just as strong next season if everybody stays for Shaheen Holloway, who picked up a lot of respect this year. So there's going to be a lot of drama and a lot of marquee matchups, so to speak, for Iona next season. I'm looking forward to it just as you are.
MAC always fun and delivering those great matchups. Now, Pitino, in the release put out by Iona, said that this is his last stop. He wanted to come home to New York, and this is where he's going to end. Do you see this as the last place that Pitino is going to be on the sideline?
I'll believe it when I see it. I've covered Rick Pitino in the Big East before, so I have a little bit more of a sense of what to expect compared to some other people around the MAC that are going to be dealing with him for the first time and maybe blinded by his Hall of Fame credentials, so to speak. It's going to be very hard for him to resist the allure of a Power 5 or 6 school potentially opening up in a year or two and offering him one last shot with the big boys. I want to see if he upholds his end of the bargain. Right now, I'm going to say I'll believe it when I see it, because I do think if he has a chance to bolt in 2 or 3 years, he just might. But let's see how year 1 goes, year 2 goes, before I can definitively say, okay, this is going to be it for him.
Will definitely be a lot of attention drawn to New Rochelle now with Pitino on the sideline and at the helm. But Jaden, you've covered Iona for so long now, and put the Tim Cluse era in perspective. 10 years at the helm, 9 of them active, 6 trips to the Big Dance, winning either the MAC tournament championship or the regular season championship in 8 of those years. What was that time period like for Iona, and what does Tim Cluse mean to the Gaels?
Iona turned into the East Coast version of Gonzaga, and let's just call it what it is. And Tim Cluse didn't get anywhere near enough credit for the job that he did, taking this program that was just 3 years removed from going 2-28 in 2006-07, and taking this program years later to heights that hadn't been seen since before either of us were born, when Jim Valvano was taking this program to national heights in the late 70s, beating Louisville. And if the NCAA tournament was as big a spectacle as it is now, they probably would have gone to the Sweet 16 with a team like that. There's no true quantity to put on what Tim Cluse has meant to this program. There are a lot of intangibles that we've both seen that you can't put any definitive value on. He's one of those true legends where you just have to be around him to see the full impact. But to the casual fan, it's going to take a lot to live up to what he said for the last 10 years.
Jaden certainly has been some great times in New Rochelle during the Tim Cluse era, and we'll see what happens now with Rick Pitino. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Ian. Anytime.